Welcome back. This is Module 3, working with vocational rehabilitation, a business perspective, the general steps and timeline. And what I'm going to cover here are the general steps that vocational rehabilitation might use to support self-employment and a rough timeline, looking at how long it takes to complete each step and what you can do during those steps. So I want to begin with kind of the overview of the general steps. And let's start with the end, which we actually covered in the big picture module. I think it's really important to know where you're going and that all these steps are really leading to this scenario here. But it begins with a business assessment, and this could be formal, it can be informal. It depends really on what your disability is and what vocational rehabilitation thinks that you need to support self-employment. But this is the point where they're going to decide, self-employment, or a counselor is going to decide whether self-employment may be a good possibility for you to explore going forward in your career choice. So they may give you a questionnaire, they may give you something much more formal, but they're basically going to decide whether or not this makes sense. The next step is a feasibility study, and this is typically where I actually receive a phone call or an email about a client that potentially is looking at self-employment. So this is really the first part of the process for me, but it's an additional step in the process for self-employment. And what this step is going to do is to look at the viability of the business idea. And we're going to cover this here in our next module in more detail. The step after that is the business plan. The business plan is the roadmap of how we're going to make this scenario happen, how we're going to get support from vocational rehabilitation and leverage that support, if you will. We're going to bring that all together and create this roadmap in what's called a business plan. And typically what happens is these two documents are prepared with the help of a qualified business expert. Vocational rehabilitation is absolutely excellent at helping people to become employed, and they're really good at helping people to become self-employed as well, but they're not business people. So they'll bring in an outside expert like myself to help navigate this process. And what will happen here is that the qualified business expert will help to produce the feasibility study and then guide the development of the business plan with the client. And all of all the information that is generated in these two documents then goes forward to what's called the Self-Employment Committee. And I've had the good fortune of sitting on that committee now for nearly 3 years. And it receives all the business plans for the state of Oregon and reviews those plans on a monthly basis. And what this committee does is it has several folks on it that will look at all the documents and everything that's in place and determine whether or not this is ready to go or not. And I'll get into that. I'll talk about that in a later video module. So these three are upcoming video modules. This one we've already talked about in the big picture. This is when it happens in the business and launch. And actually there's a monitoring phase that vocational rehabilitation will go through here as you report back to your counselor on your financial performance and how things are going in your business sense. But that doesn't involve a qualified business expert. But there's definitely an active process that goes on here. But this is the part, these feasibility study, business plan, and self-employment committee, and maybe a little bit into the launch that I will typically see. So those are the general steps that are going to happen here in vocational rehabilitation. And so if you've recently been referred to myself as a qualified business expert or someone else, you're probably starting at this phase here. And what you need to know is this is going to happen next, the business plan, it's going to go to this committee, and then if it's approved, then you launch. Now I want to be clear that this is the sequence of steps, but at any time, vocational rehabilitation can say, no, this does not make sense, and you might say, no, this doesn't make sense, and exit this process. So this is not a guarantee. This is not once you get into this process, this is the way it's going to go. This is what's going to happen if the feasibility study and business plan and the evidence collected supports your business concept and vocational rehabilitation agrees that this is a good direction for you to become employed. Then this process follows the sequential steps. But you can exit on your own, or vocational rehabilitation may stop supporting you at any one of these steps. I want to be clear about that because it's not a guarantee. That's why I say general steps. In terms of time, This is the part here, the feasibility study. This is the point where I'll actually receive a phone call. But I've talked to clients that have spent quite some time working through their disability and figuring out what's going on and where they're at, and actually starting to take a look at the business and what it might be, and if this is even an appropriate option. So I've seen this be weeks, and I've seen it go months and even longer. There's no real rule of thumb. It's individual. It's case by case. And this is between you and your vocational rehabilitation counselor as far as to how long this takes. But this is the part that I'm more familiar with and that typically starts the business process. And that will take probably about 1 to 2 months on average. That's been my experience. Other qualified business experts, it could take shorter, it could take longer. It depends on their process. But it will take probably on the average of months to produce that feasibility study. And basically what's going to happen, and we'll cover this in the next module, is that your QBE is going to either recommend that you go forward because the feasibility study supports that, or recommend that you find another alternative route to employment. The next step, once the counselor and the branch manager approve, is the business plan. That too will take about 1 to 2 months to complete. Again, it depends on the complexity. I've seen businesses that are starting very early and there's a lot of groundwork be done and it can take longer. I've seen businesses that are very complex and that will lengthen the timeline. The average of those seems to be falling about here. I think it's important to note, too, that these timelines also depend on how prepared you are and how forthcoming you are with the information that both your counselor and your qualified business expert are asking you. So these timelines assume that you're actually providing that information and things are clicking right along. So if you're not prepared and you're not giving information to the counselor and you're not engaged in the process, that will extend these timelines. The Self-Employment Committee actually meets once a month. The meeting only lasts about an hour or maybe a little less or a little more depending on the client. And there'll be 1 or 2 outcomes. One will be that everything's there and the committee is comfortable and will approve that request. And then it goes back to the branch manager and counselor for implementation. Or typically what's more common these days is that the committee will ask follow-up questions. In that case, it'll go back to your counselor and to you to answer those remaining questions. There may be concerns, things that are not described as well as they need to be. More information is needed by the committee. My advice to you is that if you get questions back, work on them as quickly as you can. To get those done. And if that happens, you could be looking at this being about a 3 to 4 week process. Again, it's on average, it's not a guarantee, and the process varies a great deal. But that's a pretty typical pattern in my experience. So if you look at how this whole thing plays, from the time you start the feasibility process, you could be looking at 5 months before you actually get to launch. It could likely take longer. So I think that the main takeaway here is that this does take some time to do. I think it's worth it. There's certainly, vocational rehabilitation support in many ways is so very valuable when you're starting a business and you're trying to accommodate your disability. So it's definitely worth doing, but it's not a quick process. This isn't something that's going to happen in weeks and or even in a couple of months. So you have to be patient, and I think the best thing you can do is to be on top of it, to be working with your qualified business expert to be moving this process forward, be working with your counselor to understand the process as it goes. So if you do all of that, I think this can be a very smooth process and move forward in a reasonable amount of time. Should also mention too here, this time varies, but again, this could happen anywhere from 6 to 12 months depending on how fast the business achieves its goals of getting to break even. So that's the general steps that you go through in this process and the general timeline. Again, don't hold me to these. In fact, I'm going to put this little caveat up here. Circumstances may vary. I do not control all of this. You do not control all of this. And your counselor doesn't control all of it. It's really up to all of us as a team to make this work and to work smoothly. So my best advice is learn it, educate yourself about what's required, and be on top of it going forward. See you on the next lesson.